the United States government in our Article III courts. Let me abandon them. You said police ought to be held accountable. But do you believe that it is ever, under any circumstances, appropriate for somebody to assault a police officer, for example?
There's virtually no defense for that kind of action, and I do believe that we are failing to appreciate police officers who place their lives at risk, as this sergeant was just killed yesterday trying to deal with a violent criminal and vindicate the law, and she was killed. That is the kind of thing that too often happens. We need to be sure that when we criticize law officers, it is narrowly focused on the right basis for criticism, and to smear whole departments places those officers at greater risk. And we are seeing an increase in murder of police officers. It was up 10% last year. So I just could say, I could feel in my bones how it was going to play out in the real world when we had what I thought oftentimes was legitimate criticism of a perhaps wrongdoing by an officer, but spilling over to a condemnation of our entire police force. And morale has been affected, and it's impacted the crime rates in Baltimore and crime rates in Chicago. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I regret that's happening. I think it can be restored, but we need to understand the requirement that police work with the community and be respectful of their community, but we as a nation need to respect our law officers too.
Well, I, for one, appreciate your comments, because we ought to hold our police and law enforcement officers up in the high regard to which they deserve based on their service to the communities. And your comments remind me to some extent of Chief David Brown's comments, the Dallas police chief, following the tragic killing of 5 Dallas police officers recently, where he said that police ought to be held accountable, but under no circumstances could any assault against a police officer be justified based on what somebody else did somewhere at some time. So I, for one, appreciate that very much. You mentioned Baltimore and Chicago, and we've seen an incredible number of people, frequently in minority communities, who've been killed as results of crimes related to felons who perhaps are in possession of guns that they have no legal right to be in possession of. Earlier you talked about prosecuting gun crimes, and I'm glad to hear you say that. Project Exile, which originated, I think, in Richmond, Virginia, which targeted felons and other people who cannot legally own or possess firearms, was enormously effective. And when I look at the record of the last 5 and 10 years at the Justice Department, prosecution of those kinds of crimes down 15.5% in the last 5 years, down 34.8% in the last 10 years. Can you assure us that you will make prosecuting those people who cannot legally possess or use firearms a priority again in the Department of Justice, and help break the back of this crime wave that's affecting so many people in our local communities like Chicago or Baltimore, and particularly minority communities?
I can, Senator Cornyn. I'm familiar with how that plays out in the real world. My best judgment, colleagues, is that properly enforced, the federal gun laws can reduce crime and violence in our cities and communities. It was highlighted in Richmond and Project Exile, but I have to tell you, I've always believed that. When I was United States Attorney in the 80s and into the early 90s, we produced a newsletter that went out to all local law enforcement called Project Triggerlock, and went to federal law enforcement too, and it highlighted the progress that was being made by prosecuting criminals who use guns to carry out their crimes. Criminals are most likely the kind of person that will shoot somebody when they go about their business. And if those people are not carrying guns because they believe they might go to federal court, be sent to a federal jail for 5 years perhaps, they'll stop carrying those guns during their drug dealing and their other activities that are criminal. Fewer people get killed. fewer people get killed. So I truly believe that we need to step that up. It's a compassionate thing. If one of these individuals carrying a gun shoots somebody, not only is there a victim, they end up with hammering and sentenced in jail for interminable periods. The culture, the communities are safer with fewer guns in the hands of criminals.
Thank you.
Before we go to Senator Whitehouse, people have asked, members have asked me about our break, and if it's okay with Senator Sessions, it would work out about 1 o'clock if we have 3 on this side and 3 on this side for the 1 hour, because it's noon right now. Is that okay with you, Senator Sessions?
Mr. Chairman, I'm at your disposal.
And so this will give my colleagues an opportunity that want to go to the respective political party caucuses to go, and we would take a recess of about 30 to 40 minutes.
That's very fair.
Okay. Thank you, Senator. So then now, Senator Whitehouse.
Senator Sessions, hello.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse.
When we met, I told you that I was going to ask you a particular question, so I'm going to lead off with that particular question. Following the Gonzalez scandals at the Department of Justice, the department adopted procedures governing communications between the White House and the Department of Justice, consistent with constraints that were outlined years ago in correspondence between Senator Hatch and the Reno Justice Department, limiting contacts between a very small number of officials at the White House and a very small number of officials at the Department of Justice. Will you honor and maintain those procedures at the Department of Justice?
I will, Senator Whitehouse. You, as an honorable and effective United States Attorney yourself, know how that works and why it's important. Attorney General McCasey issued a firm and
Very clear about
I think
supporting
his
that
is probably
policy. Yes.
maybe still pending, and I would say to you, well, that's the appropriate way to do it. After you and I talked, I've read the Reno memorandum, the Gorelick memorandum, and I think I would maintain those rules.
On the subject of honorable prosecutions, when is it appropriate for a prosecutor to disclose derogatory investigative information about a subject who was not charged?
That's a very dangerous thing, and it's a pretty broad question as you've asked it, but you need to be very careful about that, and there are certain rules, like grand jury rules, that are very significant.
And isn't it also true that it is customary practice, because of the concern about the improper release of derogatory investigative information, that the department customarily limits its factual assertions, even after an individual has been charged, to the facts that were charged in the information or the indictment?
I believe that's correct, yes. That's a standard operating policy in most offices. There may be some exceptions, but I think that's standard operating procedure in the United States Attorney's offices like you and I had.
As a question of law, does waterboarding constitute torture?
Well, there was a dispute about that when we had the torture definition in our law. The Department of Justice memorandum concluded it did not necessarily prohibit that, but Congress has taken an action now that makes it absolutely improper and illegal to use waterboarding or any other form of torture in the United States by our military and by all our other departments and agencies.
Consistent with the wishes of the United States military?
They have been supportive of that, and in fact, I just take a moment to defend the military. The military
You don't need
never
to defend them from me. I'm all for
I know,
our military.
but so many people, truly believe, think that the military conducted waterboarding. They never conducted any waterboarding. That was by intelligence agencies. Their rules were maintained. I used to teach the Geneva Conventions and the rules of warfare as an Army reservist to my personnel, and the military did not do that.
And General Petraeus sent a military-wide letter disavowing the value of torture, as we both know. Another question as a matter of law. Is fraudulent speech protected by the First Amendment?
Well, fraudulent speech, if it amounts to an attempt to obtain a thing of value for the person the fraudulent speech is directed,
Which is an element of fraud.
Absolutely fraud and can be prosecuted. And I think we see too much of that. We see these phone calls at night to elderly people. We see mailings go out that seem to me to be awfully far from truth and seducing people to probably make unwise decisions.
So fraudulent corporate speech would also not be protected by the First Amendment.
That is correct, and it's subject to civil and/or criminal complaint.
And speaking of civil complaints, was the Department of Justice wrong when it brought and won the civil RICO action against the tobacco industry?
Well, Senator, they won those cases. They took them to court and eventually won a monumental victory. That is correct. And it's
Hard to say
part
they
of the
were
law and firmly established.
Hard to say they were wrong if they won, right?
That's correct.
As you know, the United States has retaliated against Russia for its interference with the 2016 elections. In Europe, Baltic states, Germany, and Italy have raised concerns of Russia meddling in their country's elections. I know this has been touched on before, but I want to make sure it's clear. Will the Department of Justice and the FBI under your administration be allowed to continue to investigate the Russian connection, even if it leads to the Trump campaign and Trump interests and associates? And can you assure us that in any conflict between the political interests of the president and the interests of justice, you will follow the interests of justice, even if your duties require the investigation and even prosecution of the president, his family, and associates?
Well, Senator Whitehouse, if there are laws violated and they can be prosecuted, then of course you'll have to handle that in an appropriate way. I would say that the problem may turn out to be, as in the Chinese hacking of our hundreds of thousands of, maybe millions of records, it has to be handled at a political level. And I do think it's appropriate for a nation who feels that they've been hacked and that information has been improperly used to retaliate against those actions. It's just a...
And I know we share a common interest in advancing the cybersecurity of this nation, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on that. Let me ask you a factual question. During the course of this boisterous political campaign, did you ever chant, "Lock her up"?
No, I did not. I don't think. I heard it in rallies and so forth, sometimes I think humorously done, but it was a matter that I have said a few things, a special prosecutor. I favored that. I think that probably is one of the reasons I believe that I should not make any decision about any such case.
And you understand that the good guy lawman in the movies is the one who sits on the jailhouse porch and doesn't let the mob in.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I'm from Rhode Island, as you know, Senator. We have NAACP and ACLU members who've heard you call their organization, who've heard that you called their organizations un-American. We have a vibrant Dominican community who look at Big Papi, David Ortiz, swinging his bat for the Red Sox and wonder why you said, quote, "Almost no one coming from the Dominican Republic to the United States is coming here because they have a provable skill that would benefit us." I represent a lot of Latinos who worry about modern-day Palmer raids breaking up parents from their kids, and Muslims who worry about so-called patrols of Muslim homes and neighborhoods. And I've heard from police chiefs who worry that you, as Attorney General, will disrupt law enforcement priorities that they have set out and disrupt the community relations that they have worked hard over years of community engagement to achieve. Time is short, but I noticed that in your prepared remarks, these are not unforeseeable concerns, and your prepared remarks did very little to allay the concerns of those people. Is there anything you'd like to add now in our closing minute?
Well, thank you. My comment about the NAACP arose from a discussion that I had where I expressed concern about their statements that were favoring, as I saw it, Sandinista efforts and communist guerrilla efforts in Central America. And so I said they could be perceived as un-American and weaken their moral authority to achieve the great things they had been accomplishing in integration and moving forward for reconciliation throughout the country. And I believe that clearly. And I never said and accused them of that. Number two,
So what would you
with
tell
regard,
Jim Vincent of the NAACP in Rhode Island right now? He's the head of the NAACP.
well, I would say, please look at what I've said about that and how that came about. And it was not in that context. It was not correct. I said in 1986 that NAACP represents one of the greatest forces for reconciliation and racial advancement of any entity in the country, probably number one. That's what I said then. I believed it, and I believe it now. And it's an organization that has done tremendous good for us. With regard to the Dominican Republic, I had gone on a CODEL with Senator Specter. We came through the Dominican Republic. We visited public service housing projects that seemed to be working and did other things of that nature. And I went and spent some time with the consular official there just to ask him about things. And what I learned was that there's a good bit of fraud in it, and he was somewhat discouraged in his ability to, he felt, to do his job. And we also understood and discussed that the immigration flow is not on a basis of skills. The immigration flow from almost all of our countries, frankly, is based on family connection and other visas rather than a skilled-based program more like Canada has today. And that's all I intended to be saying there. Tell anybody that heard that statement, please don't see that as a diminishment or a criticism of the people of the Dominican Republic. It was designed to just discuss, in my remarks, the reality of our immigration system today. I'd like to see it more skill-based, and I think that would be helpful.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Before I go to Senator Lee, there's an evaluation of the work of Senator Sessions during his time as U.S. Attorney that I think speaks to his outstanding record. I'm made aware of this because Senator Feinstein requested an evaluation of Senator Sessions' office from the Department of Justice, and I'd note just a few points from their evaluation. Back in 1992, a couple short sentences. All members of the judiciary praised the U.S. Attorney for his advocacy skills, integrity, leadership of the office, and accessibility. And the second quote, the USAO for the Southern District of Alabama is an excellent office with outstanding leadership, personnel, and morale. The district is representing the United States.
Environmental movement.
Concluded without objection. Senator Lee.
Hello, Senator Sessions.
Hello.
I've enjoyed working with you over the last 6 years and always found you to be someone who treats colleagues, regardless of differing viewpoints, with dignity and respect. You've taught me a great deal in the 6 years I've been here, and I've appreciated the opportunity to work with you. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're both lawyers, although being a lawyer around here, certainly having a law degree is not unusual. One of the things that sets you apart and makes you different, I get the sense from you that you think of yourself not so much as a senator who used to be a lawyer, but as a lawyer who is currently serving as a senator. And I think that's an important thing, especially for someone who's been named to be the next Attorney General of the United States. Even though you and I have never had the opportunity to discuss the intricacies of the rule against perpetuities or the difference between the doctrine of worthier title and the rule in Shelley's case, I get the sense that you would eagerly engage in such banter when occasion arises. So maybe in a subsequent round we'll have the opportunity to do that. But this does raise a discussion that I'd like to have with you about the role of the lawyer. As you know, a lawyer understands who his or her client is. Anytime you are acting as a lawyer, you've got a client. This is a simple thing if you're representing an individual, because in almost every instance, unless the client is incapacitated, you know who the client is. The client has one mouthpiece, one voice, and you know what the interests of that client are, and you can evaluate those based on the interests expressed by the client. It gets a little more complicated when you're representing a corporate entity. Typically, you'll interact either with a general counsel or with the chief executive officer. The bigger an entity gets, the more complex it gets. There might be some ripples in this relationship between the lawyer and the client. In the case of the U.S. government and the Attorney General's representation of that client, this is a particularly big and powerful client. And that client has many interests. In a sense, the client is, of course, the United States of America, but at the same time, the Attorney General is there put in place by the President of the United States and serves at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And so, in that respect, the Attorney General has several interests to balance and must at once regard him or herself as a member of the President's cabinet, remembering how the Attorney General got there and can be removed at any moment by the President. And at the same time, the Attorney General has the obligation to be independent, to provide an independent source of analysis for the President and for the President's team and cabinet. How do you understand these things as a former U.S. attorney, as a former line prosecutor, and as a senator who served on the Judiciary Committee? You've had a lot of opportunities to observe this process. How do you see the proper balancing between all these interests from the standpoint of the Attorney General?
That's a very insightful or probing question, and it touches on a lot of the important issues that we, as Attorney General, would need to deal with. There are even sometimes these government agencies are like foreign countries. They negotiate memorandums of understanding that are akin to a treaty, actually. They can't seem to work together oftentimes in an effective way. And so the Attorney General is required to provide opinions on that. The Attorney General ultimately owes his loyalty to the integrity of the American people and to the fidelity to the Constitution and the legitimate laws of the country. That's what he's ultimately required to do. However, every Attorney General that has been appointed by a president, or they wouldn't become Attorney General, and they've been confirmed by the Senate, or they wouldn't be made Attorney General. And so they do understand, I think, that if a president wants to accomplish a goal that he or she believes in deeply, then you should help them do it in a lawful way, but make clear and object if it's an unlawful action. That helps the president avoid difficulty. It's the ultimate loyalty to him. And you hope that a president, and I hope President-elect Trump has confidence in me, so that if I give him advice that something can be done or can't be done, that he would respect that. That's an important relationship, too. But ultimately, you are bound by the laws of the country.
Some of that, I assume, could come into play when you're dealing with a politically sensitive case, and with a case that is politically sensitive because it relates to a member of the administration or to the interplay between the executive branch and the legislative branch, for example. In some of those instances, there can be calls for a special prosecutor. On the one hand, this is a way of taking the Attorney General out of the equation so that it can be handled in a manner that reflects a degree of separation between the administration and the case. On the other hand, there are constitutional questions that are sometimes raised, and sometimes people argue that this places too much of a presumption that the special prosecutor will seek an indictment in order to justify the expense and the time put into appointing a special prosecutor. For reasons that relate to the complexity of these considerations, there are, of course, guidelines in place that can help guide the determination to be made by the Attorney General as to when, whether, how to put in place a special prosecutor. But even within these guidelines, there's a lot of flexibility, a lot of discretion in the hands of the Attorney General in deciding how to do that. Do you have anything that you would follow? What can you tell us about what considerations you would consider in deciding whether or not to appoint a special prosecutor?
Well, it is not a little matter. It is a matter that's created controversy over the years. I don't think it's appropriate for the Attorney General just to willy-nilly create special prosecutors. History has not shown that has always been a smart thing to do. But there are times when objectivity is required and the absolute appearance of objectivity is required, and perhaps a special prosecutor is appropriate. The Attorney General Lynch, for example, did not appoint a special prosecutor on the Clinton matter. And I did criticize that. I was a politician. We had a campaign on. I didn't research the law in depth. It was just a reaction as a senator of a concern. But there should be great care should be taken in deciding how to make the appointment or if an appointment of a special prosecutor is required. The Department of Justice, you're not required to be a judge, to be a prosecutor. One judge said there's nothing wrong with a prosecutor who likes his work and doesn't think laws should be violated. Is that a bias? I don't think so. I think that's a strength. So I just would say that's kind of the way, the best I could give you at this point, Senator Lee.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. Another challenging issue that relates to this duty of independence that attorneys general have relates to the Office of Legal Counsel. It's of course the job of the Office of Legal Counsel, or OLC as it's sometimes known, to issue opinions within the executive branch on a wide array of subjects. Some are subjects that a lot of people would find interesting. Others are subjects that only a lawyer could love, and sometimes only a lawyer specializing in something esoteric or specific. There's one recent OLC opinion entitled "Competitive Bidding Requirements under the Federal Federal Highway Aid Program." There aren't perhaps that many people who would find that interesting, but there are a lot of others that would capture immediately the public's interest. What's significant about all of these, though, no matter how broad or narrow the topic, no matter how politically sexy or dull the topic might be, they, in many instances, almost conclusively resolve a legal question within the executive branch of government. And in many instances, they're doing so on the basis of constitutional determinations that may or may not ever be litigated, such that the broaching of a constitutional topic might be opened, studied, and resolved entirely within the executive branch, largely as a result of how the lawyers within the Office of Legal Counsel decide to do their jobs. What can you tell me about what you would do, if confirmed, to ensure that the Office of Legal Counsel maintains a degree of professionalism and independence requisite for this task?
Senator Lee, that office is important. It does adjudicate or actually opine on important issues related to conflicts or disputes within the great executive branch of the American government. Like you said, what kind of competition is required before you get a highway grant? There may be a disagreement about that, and OLC is asked to review it and state one position, that the government of the United States is one. It's not a multiple government. These departments are not independent agencies. And so that office is so exceedingly important, as you indicate, because many times those opinions hold, and they set policy and they affect things. Sometimes it also has the power, and I'm sure you would be sensitive to expand or constrict the bureaucracies in their ability to execute under statutes. In other words, is this within their power or is it not within their power? So there's some of the things like that that can impact the American people over time in a significant way.
Thank you.
Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Senator Sessions. You and I have worked together on a number of bills, including leading the International Adoption Simplification Act, which I believe made a big difference to a lot of families in keeping their siblings together when they were adopted. Senator Cornyn and I led the sex trafficking bill that passed last year, and you had some important provisions in that. And then we've worked together on law enforcement issues, and I appreciate your respect and the support that you have from that community. And I also thank you for your work on drug courts, something we both share as former prosecutors and believe in the purpose of those courts. But I wanted to lead first with another part of the Justice Department's jobs, and that's protecting civil rights and the right to vote. My state has the highest voter turnout in the last election of any state. We're pretty proud of that. And as county attorney for 8 years for Minnesota's biggest county, I played a major role in making sure that the election laws were enforced and that people who were able to vote could vote and that people who shouldn't vote didn't vote. Since the Voting Rights Act became law more than 50 years ago, we've made progress, but I've been very concerned about some of the movements by states to restrict access to voting in recent years. We haven't been able to pass the Bipartisan Voting Rights Advancement Act forward last Congress, and I just think it's an area that's going to be ripe for a lot of work going forward. You and I talked about how at one point you previously called the Voting Rights Act an intrusive piece of legislation, and I wondered if you could explain that as well as talk about how you will actively enforce the remaining pieces of the Act. That would be Section 2, which prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, and the Section 3 bail-in provision through which most states can be subject to preclearance. And you don't have to go into great detail on those two sections. You could do it later. But if you could just explain your views of the Voting Rights Act moving forward and what would happen in terms of enforcement if you were Attorney General.
The Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, was one of the most important acts to deal with racial difficulties that we face, and it changed the whole course of history, particularly in the South. There was a clear finding that there were discriminatory activities in the South, that a number of states were systematically denying individuals the right to vote. And you go back into the history, you can see it plainly. Actions and rules and procedures were adopted in a number of states with the specific purpose of blocking African Americans from voting. And it was just wrong, and the Voting Rights Act confronted that. And it, in effect, targeted certain states and required even the most minor changes in voting procedure, like moving a precinct across.
So how would you approach this going forward? For instance, the Fifth Circuit's decision that the Texas voter ID law discriminates against minority voters, that was written by a Bush appointee. Do you agree with that decision? How would you handle this moving forward?
Well, I have not studied that. There's going to be a debate about it. Courts are ruling on it now, and that is a voter ID, and whether or not that is a improper restriction on voting that adversely impacts disproportionately minority citizens. So that's a matter that's got to be decided. On the surface of it, it doesn't appear to me to be that. I have publicly said I think voter ID laws, properly drafted, are okay. But as Attorney General, it'll be my duty to study the facts in more depth, to analyze the law. But fundamentally, that can be decided by Congress and the courts as they interpret the existing law. I did vote to extend the Voting Rights Act several years ago. I thought it included Section 5, but later Section 5 was eliminated by the Supreme Court on the basis that progress had been made. And on an intrusive question, let me answer that. It is intrusive. The Supreme Court on more than one occasion has described it legally as an intrusive act, because it only focused on a certain number of states, and normally when Congress passes a law, it applies to the whole country. So it's a very unusual thing for a law to be passed that targets only a few states. But they had a factual basis. They were able to show that it was justified in this fashion. So that's the foundation for it, and that's why I supported it, its renewal.
Mm-hmm. And I think you'll understand as you look at this issue that there are many voters, people who are trying to vote, that view some of these rules that are put in place as intrusive for them because it makes it harder for them to vote. And I think that is the balance that you're going to need to strike. And I hope, coming from a state that has such high voter turnout, that has same-day registration, very good turnout in Iowa as well, right below us, states that have put in place some really expansive voter laws, and it doesn't mean Democrats always get elected. We've had Republican governors in Minnesota, we have a Republican governor in Iowa, and I just point out that I think the more we can do to encourage people to vote, the better democracy we have. And I want to turn to another quick question on a Democratic issue, as in a democracy issue that was raised by Senator Graham and as Senator Whitehouse. I just returned with Senators McCain and Graham from a trip to Ukraine, Baltics, Georgia, and learned there about how these intrusive cyber attacks are not just unique to our country, not just unique to one party, not just unique to one election, and they've seen that movie before in those countries. And do you have any reason to doubt the accuracy of the conclusion reached by our 17 intelligence agencies that, in fact, Russia used cyber attacks to attempt to influence this last election? I'm not asking if you believe that influenced it, just if you believe the report of our intelligence agencies.
I have no reason to doubt that and have no evidence that would indicate otherwise.
Thank you. Violence Against Women Act, Senator Leahy asked some of those questions, really important to me. You and I discussed it. I just have one question there. If confirmed, will you continue to support the life-saving work being done by the Office on Violence Against Women?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Immigration, you and I have some different views on this, and I often focus on the economic benefits of immigration, the fact that we have 70 of our Fortune 500 companies headed by immigrants. At one point, 200 of our Fortune 500 companies were either formed by immigrants or kids of immigrants. Roughly 25% of all U.S. Nobel laureates were foreign-born. And just to understand, in a state like mine where we have entry-level workers in dairies are immigrants, major doctors at the Mayo Clinic, police officers who are Somali, if you see that economic benefit of immigrants in our society.
Well, immigration has been a high priority for the United States. We've been the leading country in the world in accepting immigration. I don't think American people want to end immigration. I do think that if you bring in a larger flow of labor than we have jobs for, it does impact adversely the wage prospects and the job prospects of American citizens. I think as a nation we should evaluate immigration on whether or not it serves and advances the national interest, not the corporate interest. It has to be the people's interest first, and I do think too often Congress has been complacent in supporting legislation that might make businesses happy, but it also may have had the impact of pulling wages down. Dr. Borjas at Harvard has written about that. I think he's the world's perhaps most effective and knowledgeable scholar, and he says that does happen. Wages can be diminished, and one of the big cultural problems we have today is middle class and lower class Americans have not, lower class economically, are not having the wage increases that we'd like to see them have. In fact, since 2000, wages are still down from what they were in 2000.
Mm-hmm. I just see that we can do a mix of making sure that we have jobs for people here and then understanding that we're a country of immigrants.
On that subject, you're familiar with Canada.
Okay.
And we are people of America. You have actively gone against pro-immigrant legislation that would keep white families together. You are anti-immigrant. You are supported by hate groups that have been trying to push racist legislation. You are not a good attorney general.
Mr. Mr. Chairman, if I could just have another 30 seconds here. I had one last question.
Maybe 45 seconds, Mr. Chair. I would just say that
Yeah.
you come up close to the Canadian system. I think may be some of those policies ought to be considered by the United States.
My last question, Mr. Chairman, is on the reporters issue. Free press, I believe, is essential to our democracy, and I've always fought to ensure that those rights aren't compromised. My dad was a reporter, a newspaper reporter for years, and I'm especially sensitive to the role of the press as a watchdog. You've raised concerns in the past about protecting journalists from revealing their sources. You did not support the Free Flow of Information Act. In 2015, the Attorney General revised the Justice Department rules for when federal prosecutors can subpoena journalists or their records, and he also committed to releasing an annual report on any subpoenas issues or charges made against journalists, and committed not to put reporters in jail for doing their job. If confirmed, will you commit to following the standards already in place at the Justice Department, and will you make that commitment not to put reporters in jail for doing their jobs?
Senator Klobuchar, I'm not sure. I have not studied that, those regulations. I would note that when I was United States Attorney, we knew, everybody knew, that you could not subpoena a witness or push them to be interviewed if they were a member of the media without approval at high levels of the Department of Justice. That was in the 1980s. And so I do believe the Department of Justice does have sensitivity to this issue. There have been a few examples of where the press and the Department of Justice haven't agreed on these issues, but for the most part, there is a broadly recognized and proper deference to the news media. But you could have a situation in which a media is really not the unbiased media we see today, and they could be a mechanism through which unlawful intelligence is obtained. There are other dangers that could happen with regard to the federal government that normally doesn't happen to the media covering murder cases in the states.
All right. Well, thank you, and I'll follow up with that in a written question when you have a chance to look at
If you
those.
would, I would.
Thank you. Thank you.
I call for the first time on a new member of the committee, Senator Sass from Nebraska.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for having me. Before I get started, I'd like to enter into the record a letter of support from 25 current state attorneys general, including Doug Peterson, the Attorney General from my state of Nebraska. The letter reads in part, "No one is more qualified to fill this role than Senator Sessions. This is obviously important testimony from the top law enforcement officers of 25 states. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to include this in the record."
Without objection, it will be included. Proceed, Senator Sass.
Thank you. Senator Sessions, when you were introducing your grandkids, and I'm amazed that they stayed around as long as they did, mine would have been more disruptive earlier, I was thinking about all the time I spend in schools, and we have a crisis in this country of civic ignorance. Our kids don't know basic civics, and we have a crisis of public trust in this country in that many Americans presume that people in the city are overwhelmingly motivated by partisan perspectives rather than the public good. Tragically, our current president, multiple times over the last 3 or 4 years, has exacerbated this political polarization by saying that he didn't have legal authority to do things and then subsequently doing exactly those things. Quite apart from people's policy perspectives on these matters, this is a crisis when kids don't understand the distinction between the legislative and the executive branches, and when American voters don't think that people who serve in these offices take their oaths seriously. So it's not always as simple as Schoolhouse Rock jingles on Saturday morning, but could you at least start by telling us what you think the place for executive orders and executive actions are?
That's a good question and a good premise that we should think about. People are taught Schoolhouse Rock is not a bad basic lesson in how the government's supposed to work. Legislators pass laws. The Congress, the President executes laws, as does the entire administration, as passed by Congress or follows the Constitution. And the judicial branch decides disputes as a neutral umpire, an unbiased participant of any of the sides of the controversy, and does it objectively. So I think every day that we get away from that is really dangerous. And it is true that if a president says, I do not have this authority, and other people say the president does not have certain authority, and then it is done by the president, it confuses people. And it's, I think, colleagues, we too little appreciate something that's corrosive happening out in our country. There is a feeling that judges just vote when they get a big case before them on what their political agenda is and not what the Constitution actually requires. That judges can redefine the meaning of words to advance an agenda that they have that may not be the agenda of the American people. And that inevitably is corrosive to respect for law.
Thank you. But take it one step further, because there are going to be many cases, there'll be many instances where the administration in which you are likely going to end up serving will want to do things, and they'll want to know what the limits of their executive discretion is. Pieces of legislation that have been passed around here in recent years sometimes are, well over 1,000 pages with all sorts of clauses. The secretary shall ... fill in the law. So this Congress has regularly underreached and invited executive overreach. This Congress has regularly failed to finish writing laws and then invited the executive branch to do it. What are some of the markers that you would use to help understand the limits where the executive branch cannot go?
We really need to reestablish that. Professor Turley, Jonathan Turley, has written about this. It's just powerful. He's certainly an objective voice in American jurisprudence, and he says that Congress has just fallen down on its job. Now, of course, there are two ways. One of them is that it writes laws that are too broad. And I would urge all of you to be sure that when we pass a law, or you pass a law, if I'm confirmed, that that law is clear and sets limits. When it doesn't set limits, then you can have the secretary of this agency or that agency claiming they have certain authorities, and you end up with a very muddled litigation maybe resulting from it. So reestablishing the proper separation of powers and fidelity to law and to limits is an important issue, and I think that's what you're suggesting.
Could you tell me under what circumstances, if any, you think the Department of Justice can fail to enforce a law?
Well, it can fail to enforce it by setting prosecutorial policies with regard to declining to prosecute whole chunks of cases and, in fact, eliminate a statute. If a new tax is passed and the Department of Justice says it can't be collected, then the law is not followed. You also have the circumstances in which you can redefine the statute or alter, if we're talking about improper actions, it could expand the meaning of the words of the statute far beyond what Congress ever intended. And that's an abuse, too.
Not to interrupt you too soon, but the improper, but also what is proper? Because this administration has made the case regularly that they need to exercise prosecutorial discretion because of limited resources, and obviously there aren't infinite resources in the world. So what are some proper instances, in your view, when an administration might not enforce a law?
Well, critics of the immigration enforcement, the DAPA and the DACA laws, said that the prosecutorial discretion argument went too far. It basically just eliminated the laws from the books. Secondly, with regard to that, the president's the order came from Homeland Security, not from the Department of Justice, but Homeland Security's order not only said we're not going to force the law with regard to certain large classifications of people, but those people who'd not been given legal status under the laws of the United States were given photo IDs, work authorization, and Social Security numbers, and the right to participate in these government programs that would appear to be contrary to existing law. So that would, to me, suggest an overreach.
And in parallel, before the courts, what instances would it be legitimate, if any, for the Solicitor General to not defend a law in court?
That's a very good question, and then sometimes it becomes a real matter. In general, the Solicitor General, as part of the Department of Justice and the executive branch, states the position of the Department of Justice. And it has a duty, the Department of Justice does, to defend the laws passed by this body, by Congress. And they should be defended vigorously, whether or not the Solicitor General agrees with them or not, unless it can't be reasonably defended. And so sometimes you reach a disagreement about whether it's reasonably defensible or not. But that's the fundamental question. And the Department of Justice should defend laws that Congress passed unless they're unable to do so in a reasonable way.
What is the place of independent agencies in a unified executive branch, and do you envision that you will be making any recommendations to the President to rein in independent agencies in an effort to preserve the constitutional distinction between the powers of the Congress and the administrative responsibilities of an executive branch?
Senator, it's a good question, a kind of a historic question at this point in time, because it does appear to me that agencies oftentimes see themselves as independent fiefdoms. And sometimes you even hear the President complain about things clearly under his control. I remember President Clinton complaining about the death penalty processes of the Department of Federal Government when he appointed the Attorney General, who had just appointed a committee to make sure the death penalty was properly carried out. So, I mean, like, whose responsibility is this? You're in charge. You can remove the Attorney General if you're not happy. So those kind of things do continue out there that we need to be careful about. And I thank you for raising it.
I have less than a minute left, so last question, but going back to something that Senator Lee was asking about, could you just give a top-line summary of what you view the responsibilities of the OLC to be, and what the relationship would be between the OLC, the Office of the Attorney General, and the White House?
Well, OLC has statutory duties to make opinions. The OLC team reports to the Attorney General, who could reverse, I suppose, or remove the OLC head, the Deputy Attorney General, if he thought that department was not following the law. But essentially, they are given the power. As Attorney General, I had an opinions section in Alabama, and they rendered opinions on a whole host of matters when called upon from school boards and highway departments and that sort of thing. So this OLC does represent a key position in the Department of Justice. They must have extraordinary legal skill. They have to be terrific lawyers. They have to understand the constitutional order of which we are a part, and they should render objective decisions day after day, week after week. Ultimately, the responsibility of the President and the Attorney General to ensure that we have that kind of quality at OLC.
Thank you. Senator Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you.
In 2009, when you became the ranking Republican on this committee, you were interviewed about how you would approach the committee's work and nominations specifically. You said that Democrats should expect you to be fair because you had been through this process yourself back in 1986, and you felt that back then the committee had distorted your record. You said that moving forward, quote, we're not going to misrepresent any nominee's record, and we're not going to lie about it, unquote. And we certainly don't want to do that to our colleague. But I also think it's fair to expect that sitting before us today that you're not going to misrepresent your own record. That's fair to say, right?
That is fair.
Good. Now, in that same interview, you said, quote, I filed 20 or 30 civil rights cases to desegregate schools and political organizations and county commissions when I was United States Attorney. So 20 or 30 desegregation cases. Did I misread that quote?
I believe that's what I've been quoted as saying, and I suspect I said that.
Okay, now that was 2009, but in November of this year, your office said, quote, when Senator Sessions was U.S. Attorney, he filed a number of desegregation lawsuits in Alabama, not 20 or 30 this time, but a number. So tell me, did you file 20 or 30 desegregation cases, or is it some other number?
Well, thank you, Senator Frank, and it is important for us to be accurate. The records don't show that there were 20 or 30 actually filed cases. Some of the cases involve multiple defendants and multiple parties, like a school board and a county commission being sued for racial discrimination, things of that nature. But the number would be less than that, as we've looked at. So
what do you think would have caused you to say
I don't know.
that you filed 20 or 30 desegregation?
Well, we had cases going throughout my district, and some of them were started before I came and continued after I left. Some of them were brought and then settled promptly, and so it was extraordinarily difficult, actually, and I was surprised to get a record by checking the docket sheets to find out exactly how many cases were involved. I heard one lawyer from the Department of Justice agreed with
let
that
me move on.
large number, but the record doesn't justify it.
The questionnaire you submitted for today asks you to list and describe the, quote, 10 most significant litigated matters you personally handled. Personally handled. And among the cases that you listed that you personally handled are 3 voting rights cases and a desegregation case. Last week, I should note, 3 attorneys who worked at DOJ and who actually brought 3 of the 4 cases wrote an op-ed piece in which they say, quote, we can state categorically that Sessions had no substantive involvement in any of them. Now, you originally said that you personally handled 3 of these cases, but these lawyers say that you had no substantive involvement. Chairman Grassley, I would ask that op-ed from last Tuesday's Washington Post be entered into the record.
Without objection, it will be entered.
Are they distorting your record here?
Yes. In fact, one of the writers there, Mr. Hebert, spent a good bit of time in my office. He said I supported him in all the cases he brought, that I was more supportive than almost any other U.S. attorney, and that I provided office space. I signed the complaints that he brought. And as you know, Senator Franken, when a lawyer signs a complaint, he's required to affirm that he believes in that complaint and supports that complaint and supports that legal action, which I did. We sued.
So that's your personal involvement? Was that your name was on it?
Well, look, you can dispute the impact or the import of the questionnaire. Another attorney, Paul Hancock, who brought cases in our district, said, well, the Attorney General claims credit for the cases in the Department of Justice. He saw nothing wrong with my claiming that this was a case that I had handled.
Okay, 2 of the...
So you can disagree with that, but those cases
I want to get through this,
have my
and I don't want you to... I want to get through
on
this.
the docket sheet, my name is listed number 1 on the as the attorney for the case.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm one of the few members of this committee who didn't go to law school, and usually I get by just fine, but it seems to me that a lawyer, if a lawyer has just his name added to a document here or a filing there, that lawyer would be misrepresenting his record if he said he was personally handled these cases. 2 of the lawyers who wrote the op-ed have also submitted testimony for today's hearing. Mr. Jerry Hebert and Mr. Joe Rich. Mr. Hebert says, quote, says he, quote, litigated personally 2 of the 4 cases you listed. He said, I can state with absolute certainty that Mr. Sessions did not participate personally in either. Mr. Rich worked on one of the 4 cases you listed. He said, quote, I never met him at that time nor any other time, and he had no input to the case. These represent 3 of the 4 cases that you claimed that were among the top 10 cases that you personally handled. Now, in your 1986 questionnaire, you used phrases like, quote, I prepared and tried the case as sole counsel, and, quote, I was the lead prosecutor on this case, assisted by so-and-so. Why didn't you use the same level of detail in your 2016 questionnaire?
And looking at this questionnaire, we decided that was an appropriate response since it was a major historic cases in my office. Let me just reply, Senator Franken, in this fashion. Mr. Hebert, when in 1986, when he testified at my hearing, said, quote, we have had difficulty with several U.S. attorneys in cases we have wanted to bring. We have not experienced that difficulty in the cases I have handled with Mr. Sessions. In fact, quite the contrary, close quote. He goes on to say, I've had occasion numerous times to ask for his assistance and guidance. I have been able to go to him, and he has had an open door policy. And I have taken advantage of that and found him cooperative. And that is an accurate statement. I don't know Mr. Rich. Perhaps he handled a case that I never worked with. He goes on to say,
Well,
quote,
one of the cases
no, I want to, you've raised this question,
one of the
Franken.
cases that you listed was a case that Mr. Rich handled. So if you don't know him, it's hard for me to believe that you personally handled it.
Well, when I found that these cases, I had been supportive of.
Filed.
Sure, I was. Mr. Hebert says, quote, and yet I have needed Mr. Sessions' help in those cases, and he has provided that help every step of the way. In fact, I would say that my experience with Mr. Sessions has led me to believe that I have received more cooperation from him, more active involvement from him, because I have called upon him, close quote. Quote, I have worked side by side with him on some cases in the sense that I have had to go to him for some advice, close quote.
In some cases. We're not necessarily the ones you listed.
Well, look,
Okay,
this was
look,
30 years ago, and my memory was of this nature, and my memory was my support for those cases.
Your memory. Okay. Look, I'm one of the few members of this committee who's not a lawyer. The chairman, the ranking aren't. But when I hear I filed a case, you know, I don't know some of the parlance. It might have a special meaning in legal parlance. But to me, as a layman, it sounds to me like filed means I led the case or I supervised the case. It doesn't mean that my name was on it. And it seems to me, look, I'll close, Mr. Chairman, setting aside any political or ideological differences that you or I may have, DOJ is facing real challenges, whether it's protecting civil rights or defending national security, and our country needs an Attorney General who doesn't misrepresent or inflate their level of involvement on any given issue.
I hear
So I consider this serious stuff, as I know that you would if you were in my position.
Well, you are correct, Senator Franken. We need to be accurate in what we say. When this issue was raised, I did do a supplemental that said I provided assistance and guidance to Civil Rights Division attorneys, had an open door policy with them, and cooperated with them on these cases, close quote. I signed them, I supported cases, and attempted to be as effective as I could be in helping them be successful in these historic cases. I did feel that they were the kind of cases that were national in scope and deserved to be listed on the form. If I'm in error, I apologize to you. I don't think I was.
Well, you couldn't find 20 or 30 desegregation cases that you stated you had participated in, and it don't sound like you personally handled cases that you said you personally.
Well, I was on a
Thank you.
radio interview without any records, and that was my memory at the time.
I think you answered the question. Senator Flake, now it's 12:59, so at 2:09, we will adjourn for lunch. I'll be back here then at 2:39, and whoever's present will start then, but I hope everybody can be back here at least by 2:45. Or, well, whatever, I got the, you know what I mean. Go ahead, Senator Flake.
Well, thank you. Wait, you saying we're adjourned or I'm going?
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay, all right. Great. It's always nice being the last one standing between lunch.
Let's have order for Senator Flake.
Hey, I just want to say at the outset how much I've enjoyed working with you and being your colleague. I appreciate having you as a friend. It's no secret we've had difference of opinion on immigration legislation that we put forward. You've had different ideas, but I have no doubt that as Attorney General, you'll faithfully execute the office.
I'm sorry.
And I appreciate the answers that you've given today. Let me ask unanimous consent to submit a column written by our own Attorney General in Arizona, Mark Brnovich, for the Hill newspaper this week, supporting
without objection, it'll be included.
He's supporting your nomination. Let me talk to you about an aspect of immigration that's important in Arizona. As you know, we have a large border with Mexico. We have a program called Operation Streamline that has, over the years, been tremendously effective in cutting down recidivism in terms of border crossers. What it is, basically, it's intended to reduce border crossing by expeditiously prosecuting those who enter the country illegally under a no-tolerance or zero-tolerance policy. It's credited with being instrumental in achieving better border security, specifically in the Yuma sector along the western side of Arizona's border with Mexico. Nevertheless, in recent years, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona adopted a policy that ended prosecutions for those who cross without a criminal history other than simply crossing the border. I've asked Attorney General Holder and Attorney General Lynch, as well as Secretary Johnson at Homeland Security, on what is being done here, and I haven't gotten a straight answer, no matter how many times I ask the question. So I'm looking forward to a little more candor here. As Attorney General, if you're confirmed, what steps will you take to restore Operation Streamline to a zero-tolerance approach that's been so successful in Arizona, in a portion of Arizona's border?
Thank you. Senator Flake, I have enjoyed working with you, and I know the integrity with which you bring your views on the immigration system. Like you, I believe that Streamline was very effective, and I was really surprised that it's been undermined and significantly. The reports I got initially some years ago, maybe a decade or more ago, was it was dramatically effective. And so I would absolutely review that, and my inclination would be, but at least at this stage, to think it should be restored and even refined and made sure it's lawful and effective. But I think it has great positive potential to improve legality at the border.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been effective in Yuma, and I can tell you there's concern there among the Sheriff's Office, Sheriffs Wilmot and others, concern that we're seeing an increase in border crossings simply because the cartels understand very well where there's a zero-tolerance policy and where there is not. Word spreads. And we could quickly get to a situation where we have a problem in the Yuma sector like we do in the Tucson sector. Is there any reason why we haven't expanded this program to the Tucson sector if it's been successful elsewhere?
I do not know what reason that might be. It seems to me that we should examine the successes and see if they can't be replicated throughout the border.
All right. Well, thank you. look forward to working with you on that.
I appreciate that opportunity to work with you on that because I've long felt it's the right direction for us to go.
Thank you. When we have a successful program, it's difficult to see it scrapped and to see the progress that's been made in certain parts of the border done away with. Let me get to another subject here, victims' rights. This is an area of the law that you've shown particularly interest in over your time as a senator. I have with me letters of support for your nomination from various victims groups and advocates, the Victims of Crime and Leniency, Verna Watt, Victims of and Friends United, op-ed by Professors Paul Cassell and Steve Twist, all in support of your nomination. I'd ask that these documents be placed as part of the record. As Attorney General, what steps will you take to ensure that victims' rights are protected?
We cannot forget victims' rights. We have a victim witness legislation that creates within each United States Attorney's Office a victim witness coordinator, and the job of that person is to make sure that concerns of the victims are heard. If they have to come to court, to help them get there, to make sure that they don't feel threatened and are protected. That's a direct responsibility of the Department of Justice in the criminal justice system as directed by Congress. So I really think that's one step. And that's the fundamental mechanism. I think Senator Kyl was a strong advocate for that, and it helped really improve the treatment of victims in federal criminal cases. There's just no doubt about it.
Well, thank you. I was going to note the presence of former Senator Kyl, my predecessor in this office, who did so much work in this area, partnering with you. So thank you for that answer.
I'm honored that he's giving of his time to assist me in this effort. Honored very greatly.
Thank you. Let's talk about Prison Rape Elimination Act. It was mentioned previously, I think, by Senator Collins. As Attorney General, you not only led the Department of Prosecutors and law enforcement officers, but also the Bureau, you will lead not only the Department of Prosecutors and law enforcement officials, but also the Bureau of Prisons. You'll be responsible for 190,000 federal inmates currently in custody. This is an often overlooked part of the Attorney General's role, but it's an important part of the position that you're being nominated for. I believe one of the highlights in your record in the Senate is your leadership in passing the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003, or PREA, which passed both chambers without objection and was signed into law by George W. Bush. This was a bipartisan bill. You worked across the aisle with the late Senator Kennedy, as well as with Republican Representative Frank Wolf, Democrat Representative Bobby Scott in the House, and I have letters of support from anti-prison rape activists that I'd also like to put as part of the record. Without objection, if I could. Thank you. Thank you. With the law approaching its 15th anniversary, 11 states have certified that they're in compliance with the national standards. Another 41 states and territories have provided assurances that they're working toward compliance. Only 4 states and territories have chosen not to participate. Is PREA meeting the expectations you had for it when you introduced the bill in 2003?
I don't think there's any doubt that it's improved the situation. As to whether it's reached its full potential, I don't think I'm able to tell you with certainty, but I certainly think it's made a positive difference. You know, it was a special time for me. Senator Kennedy was a strong critic of me in 1986, and he said, you know, we were working on this. He said, I've wanted to work with you on legislation like this. And I think it was sort of a reconciliation moment. We also worked on another major piece of legislation for several years. It would have been rather historic, but it was private savings accounts for lower wage workers in America that I guess the financial crisis of 07 or somewhere, some things happened that ended that prospect. But I believe that it's important for American people to know that when an individual is sentenced to prison, they're not subjected to cruel and inhuman punishment under the Constitution at a minimum. And the idea that was so widely spread that there's routine sexual abuse and assaults in prisons and other kind of unacceptable activities was widespread in our media and widespread among the American people. one of our goals was to establish just how big it was, to require reporting, to and create circumstances that help ensure that a person who should be prosecuted for violence in the prison actually do get prosecuted, was a real step forward. We do not need to subject prisoners to any more punishment than the law requires.
Thank you. In the just remaining seconds I have, let me just say there's another area that we have worked on and hopefully we can continue to work on, and that's the area of duplicative DOJ grants. As you know, Department awarded approximately $17 billion in grants over the years. OIG reports, GAO reports have all shown that there's duplication and waste, sometimes fraud and abuse. We continue to commit to work to root out this kind of duplicative action there.
Well, I know you've had a history of being a staunch defender of the Treasury against those who would abuse it, and I believe the same way. It's the taxpayers' money. Every dollar that's extracted from an American citizen that goes into the government needs to get to productive, valuable activities. And any of it that's delivered for political and insufficient reasons is a cause of great concern. I will make it a priority of mine to make sure that the dollars we have are actually getting to the purposes they're supposed to go for. It's one thing to say, I did a great thing, I got more money for this good purpose, but did it really efficiently and effectively go there? Did it really make a positive difference? So I think the Department of Justice can utilize those grant programs to help valuable activities, and it needs to guard against improper activities.
Thank you, Senator Sessions. Thank you, Mr.
We'll break for about 30 minutes. We'll reconvene at 1:40. Senator Coons would be next up, and he's indicated he'll be here on time. So recess for now.
What you gonna do with all that junk?
This is the big one, the 20% off MSRP model year-end clearance at Days Chevrolet in Jasper, with huge savings over $3,600 off the redesigned Malibu. Now just $20,400. Save over $8,600 off Silverado Crew Cab LT. Now just $33,500. 20% off new Chevys. Right here, right now, at Days Chevrolet in Jasper.
Better days ahead, Days Chevrolet.
Find new roads.
El Rey and Ellijay.
El Rey Mexican Restaurant.
Family owned and operated and a local favorite for families, parties, and meetings.
Great prices.
Friendly service and delicious Mexican cuisine.
Patio dining available.
Come sing in Carlos's Cantina every Friday 9 to 1.
Eat in or take away.
Same location for 14 years. Open 7 days at the corner of Maddox Drive and 515. North Georgia's favorite Mexican cuisine. El Rey in Ellijay.
North Georgia Diamond is your source for diamonds. Come on in to view the area's largest selection of fine jewelry at North Georgia Diamond. All repairs and designs are done on site by our jewelers. And North Georgia Diamond has the lowest prices on loose diamonds. You can also sell your gold, silver, and coins at North Georgia Diamond between Walmart and Lowe's in East Ellijay. Locally owned by Bill and Allison Craig, North Georgia Diamond is your source for diamonds in North Georgia.
Looking for in a vehicle, start your search at Schottenkirk Ford Jasper. We've simplified the process so you can move on to what matters, your family.
Hello, my name is Chad Watkins. I'm the manager at Larry's Body Shop. We are a family-owned and operated business and have been serving the North Georgia area since 1978. We are located at 1216 Progress Road in Ellijay, Georgia. Our shop specializes in collision repair and we work with all major insurance companies. Larry's Body Shop is ICAR Gold, the highest role of training recognized by the collision repair industry. It is estimated that only 10% of collision shops meet these standards. Our shop consists of state-of-the-art equipment such as laser measurement system, down-drive spray booth, spot and MIG welding equipment. All of our paints are mixed on site so that we can guarantee your paint to match every time. I know that having an accident can be a stressful event. We take pride in making sure our customers are satisfied with the repair of their vehicles. Our waiting area is clean and comfortable with free Wi-Fi and refreshing beverages. So if you're in an accident, stop by and see us at Larry's Body Shop.
Hello, and we're back to the Katie Sassine Show. And if you weren't tuned in for the first segment, today's topic and this week's topic is the Week of the Whistleblowers, and right now we're talking about Edward Snowden. We just reviewed how he fled to Hong Kong to reveal the documents of classified information from the Stellar Wind program of the NSA. And upon reaching out for help to WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, in I believe 2006, he decided to look for places where Snowden could seek asylum from the U.S. government. And as you may or may not know, Julian Assange is actually confined to the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The latest news that I have is that he's still confined. I may or may not, I'm not 100% on this, but my research thus far shows that Julian Assange is confined in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he literally cannot go outside because of his founding of WikiLeaks, where people can report anonymous news in this database, which has become a big threat to intelligence agencies worldwide, because that means that there's an outlet in which their dissenters can expose their wrongdoings, which is not unconstitutional, but for some reason these whistleblowers are being labeled as criminals in the mainstream media and labeled as traitors. Now that's up to us to determine. I'm not saying it's one way or the other. I can't determine that on my own. It's up to all of us as the people to determine that. Now, in 2013, when Snowden escaped to Hong Kong, the people were protesting at the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong. The people were very passionate about it. And I'd like y'all to see a video and just check out about 1.5 minutes of these protests in Hong Kong and what these people had to say about the situation.
his war is essentially one of security versus privacy and freedom, and that governments must draw a line of how far they could go. They can't claim national security as the umbrella excuse, the umbrella reason, and authoritarian governments can just do anything they want to in the cyberspace.
Yeah, I think Snowden absolutely did the right thing. He had insider knowledge of these surveillance programs, and I think at a great personal risk, he was willing to expose this to the world. I don't think he would benefit from this in any way.
Ultimately, it's hard to see how NSA spying can be justified legally or morally. So, despite my uncertainty overall, I'm pretty sure that that's wrong. So I guess that's why I'm here.
As you can see, people in Hong Kong were well informed of the situation that was going on, at least those that showed at the U.S. consulate to protest the U.S. wanting to hold Snowden accountable for espionage. And I would like to quote the woman in the video that spoke out. There were a couple American guys that spoke out against the issue of holding Snowden accountable for wrongs. But the woman who spoke out, she really struck a chord with me when she said that governments, she was referring to governments, can't claim national security as the umbrella excuse for infringing upon individuals' freedoms. Authoritarian governments, and then she went on to say authoritarian governments can do anything they want in cyberspace. And it's all about security versus privacy and freedom. But is the infringement upon one's privacy without a warrant with probable cause, which is stated in the Fourth Amendment, should that even be up for debate? I mean, why are we having to deal with this issue? Why are we having to protest? Why are we having to fight for our privacy and our freedom? This should already be granted to us. Have we allowed our government to become authoritarian? Have we allowed our government to use security as an umbrella excuse to invade our privacy? We have, in my opinion. Let's talk about Snowden's escape, how he got out of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong wasn't going to take action. They delayed the process of transferring him to the United States, and rightfully so, because I think the people at the consulate actually thought the U.S. was wrong in what the U.S. was doing, and they were just as surprised by the NSA as Snowden was. And so they wanted to stand up for Snowden. Although they won't admit it, although they'll blame it on a paperwork issue, as stated in the first segment of the show, they said that the Americans had sent over a document with Snowden's name, with Snowden's incorrect middle name. It was listed as James instead of Joseph, and that was the reason for the delayed paperwork. And that is a valid excuse. You can't hold somebody hostage if they're listed as the wrong name. Now, I don't know what kind of other information was sent over as far as Social Security, etc., which I'm sure was, but that's a valid excuse. Now, the U.S. and its representatives, and I'm referring to Michael Hayden, former head of the CIA and NSA, they said that Hong Kong was disrespecting the U.S. basically by not sending Snowden back to the U.S. and facilitating him being sent back to the U.S. and brought before a court. So WikiLeaks, meanwhile, while he was in Moscow, they were looking for places, and I'm referring to Assange, Julian Assange, where Snowden could seek asylum from U.S. government. And as I revealed in the last part in the last segment, that destination was Moscow. So Snowden was actually accompanied in his escape from Hong Kong to Moscow by journalist or reporter for WikiLeaks, British reporter Sarah Harrison. And we've got a picture of Sarah Harrison we can show. Very nice looking young lady and very intelligent reporter for WikiLeaks. And Snowden even called her a ninja that helped him escape from Hong Kong. I suppose that she's a very clever woman, and she and Snowden had to go through a lot together in order to attain the asylum that he has now, the temporary asylum he has in Hong Kong. So Snowden and Harrison illegally left Hong Kong together, technically illegally. Snowden bought a ticket to India, so in order to hide their operations and their escape flights from the FBI and the CIA and the NSA and all U.S. intelligence, Snowden decided to divert them, and in order to do that, and with hopes to do that, he bought a ticket to India on his credit card for 2 days after the actual asylum flight was to take place out of Hong Kong to Moscow. And WikiLeaks, as stated by Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, bought over a dozen tickets out of Hong Kong in Snowden's name in order to do the same thing to hinder the U.S. from locating Snowden and Harrison. His destination, Moscow. And we have a beautiful background of Moscow right there. At the Moscow airport, when he and Harrison successfully arrived, and well, let's talk about how they left. They left the airport at Hong Kong, and the U.S. had failed to cancel Snowden's passport. Now, British citizen Sarah Harrison, that wasn't an issue for her. Her passport was good to go. But the U.S. failed to cancel Snowden's passport, so he was able to technically, legally leave Hong Kong and go to Moscow. But by the time he got to Moscow, they caught on, but we'll get to that later. At the Moscow airport, when they arrived successfully, Snowden could not receive another boarding pass to Cuba due to U.S.'s cancellation of his passport. He was to go from Hong Kong to Moscow to Cuba at this point. So he did not board the plane to Cuba. The former CIA plane, and U.S. prisoner transportation plane was actually awaiting Snowden to transport him as a fugitive back to the U.S. to be held accountable. Snowden was, however, in jurisdictions of Russia, and Snowden thought this was ironic that the U.S. would try to interfere with him while in Moscow because the jurisdictions of Russia, as Snowden said, were not particularly friendly with the U.S. But Vladimir Putin did publicly refuse Snowden's entry into Russia. Russian authorities, however, and this is all, it's all over the place, but Russian authorities, however, secretly offered Snowden a deal. He could leave the airport in exchange for working with a Russian intelligence agency, the FSB. Harrison claims that she knows that Snowden did not give any information while held by the FSB. And while held by the FSB, Snowden and Harrison were stuck in cruel and unusual conditions. In my opinion, they were stuck in an airport transit zone in one room with no windows for about a month, even without a shower. Snowden's dad was, during this time, contacted by the FBI, and Snowden's family has a history of military background. All of his, many of his predecessors have served in the military, and they're a very well-informed family when it comes to government and politics. So Snowden's government, or Snowden's dad, Snowden's government, our government, was contacted, his dad was contacted by the FBI and was asked to travel to Moscow to meet with his son, probably to get some details out of his son that maybe the FSB wasn't able to get. There was a popular support through Snowden throughout Western Europe, not only at the consulate in Hong Kong where people protesting, But people everywhere were protesting, believing Snowden deserved protection and not imprisonment for his act of whistleblowing. Snowden filed for application for asylum in 21 different Western European democracies, but everyone denied him because who was the European Union under? They're under the U.S. So if the U.S. wasn't going to allow it, neither was Europe. What Snowden needed was a country that was willing to stand up to the U.S., who didn't feel like they owed so much to the U.S. to listen to its every order. Poland was the first to deny Snowden's asylum, and then France, then Italy refused to respond, and that's according to Snowden. But there was one man, Presidente Evo Morales of Bolivia, who openly offered asylum to Snowden. We've got a picture of Evo Morales. Venezuela and Bolivia offered him asylum, but transportation there was not possible due to Europe's refusal under the jurisdiction of the U.S. to help Snowden escape. And there's Presidente Evo Morales. President Evo Morales, he did not arrive in Moscow for the sake of Edward Snowden. He arrived in Moscow to discuss the summit of gas exporting countries and expressed that he offers Snowden asylum in Bolivia publicly as a surprise before leaving Moscow. Now, this was a great patriotic act by Evo Morales, and we'll get back to that in the next segment and continue on to what's going on with Snowden now and what politicians think of him. Thank you for tuning in to the Katie Sassine Show. Stay tuned in for more on Edward Snowden in segment 2, and please follow me at Katie FYN TV.
Looking for in a vehicle? Start your search at Schottenkirk Ford Jasper. We've simplified the process so you can move on to what matters, your family.
This is the big one, the 20% off MSRP model year end clearance at Days Chevrolet in Jasper, with huge savings over $3,600 off the redesigned Malibu. Now just $20,400. Save over $8,600 off Silverado Crew Cab LT. Now just $33,500. 20% off new Chevys. Right here, right now, at Days Chevrolet in Jasper.
Better days ahead, Days Chevrolet.
Find new roads.
El Rey and Ellijay.
El Rey Mexican Restaurant.
Family owned and operated, and a local favorite for families, parties, and meetings.
Great prices.
Friendly service and delicious Mexican cuisine.
Patio dining available.
Come sing in Carlos's Cantina every Friday 9 to 1.
Eat in or take away.
Same location for 14 years. Open 7 days at the corner of Maddox Drive and 515. North Georgia's favorite Mexican cuisine. El Rey and Ellijay.
Pizza Hut makes the best pizza in the entire universe, but they won't tell you that. I've been marooned on this planet for a while now. You are an impressive race. Your children know excellent hiding places. Your oceans aren't filled with lava. And you figured out how to combine a grilled cheese sandwich with a Pizza Hut pizza. Surely interstellar travel will soon follow, and then I can finally get back home. Round. Round like home. The grilled cheese stuffed crust pizza, proof that no one out-pizzas the Hut.
Hello, my name is Chad Watkins. I'm the manager at Larry's Body Shop. We are a family-owned and operated business and have been serving the North Georgia area since 1978. We are located at 1216 Progress Road in Ellijay, Georgia. Our shop specializes in collision repair, and we work with all major insurance companies. Larry's Body Shop is ICAR Gold, the highest role of training recognized by the collision repair industry. It is estimated that only 10% of collision shops meet these standards. Our shop consists of state-of-the-art equipment such as laser measurement system, down-drive spray booth, spot and MIG welding equipment. All of our paints are mixed on site so that we can guarantee your paint to match every time. I know that having an accident can be a stressful event. We take pride in making sure our customers are satisfied with the repair of their vehicles. Our waiting area is clean and comfortable with free Wi-Fi and refreshing beverages. So if you're in an accident, stop by and see us at Larry's Body Shop.
North Georgia Diamond is your source for diamonds. Come on in to view the area's largest selection of fine jewelry at North Georgia Diamond. All repairs and designs are done on site by our jewelers. And North Georgia Diamond has the lowest prices on loose diamonds. You can also sell your gold, silver, and coins at North Georgia Diamond between Walmart and Lowe's in East Ellijay. Locally owned by Bill and Allison Craig, North Georgia Diamond is your source for diamonds in North Georgia.
What you gonna do with all that junk?
Welcome back to the Katie Sassine Show, addressing the indoctrination of the American nation. And this is the week of the whistleblowers. In segment 1, we began discussing Edward Snowden, popular American citizen, notorious for being a traitor. So, is he a traitor? Is he a hero? Well, that's up to us, upon the facts that have been given thus far, which you can check out in episode 1 from this week, and upon the facts that I will present today in this episode, we can determine for ourselves what we think of Snowden, of course, as individuals of the Republic that has become a democracy. Last week I was given a comment on my show about saying that the U.S. was a democracy, that I said that, when in fact it's a republic. But I would like to point out the fact that we're not operating as a republic, which is why I address us as a democracy. So I will address us as a democracy until further changes take place in which we become a republic again. So we last left off talking about Presidente Evo Morales of Bolivia. He is the man who spoke out and offered Julian Assange asylum. And we can pull up that picture of Evo Morales again for everyone to see here. So he was bold in the fact that he offered Snowden asylum when everyone in Western Europe, and probably, I can't say for sure, but more likely than not under the jurisdiction of the U.S. and the dictation of the U.S., everyone in Western Europe rejected him asylum. But Venezuela, and notably Bolivian President Evo Morales, openly offered Snowden asylum, which was a very bold move. However, as I stated in the last segment, transportation there was going to be impossible due to Europe's collective refusal to help Snowden, as they had prior rejected his asylum. 21 different Western European countries had rejected Snowden's asylum. It was apparent that they weren't willing to help this guy, that they looked at Snowden as a traitor, and that he should be accountable and held accountable by the U.S. government and go back home and go before court before being pardoned or imprisoned or whatever his fate was. So when President Evo Morales of Bolivia arrived in Moscow in 2013, while Snowden was there in asylum. He was there for an international summit of gas exporting countries, and he decided to express that he offered Snowden asylum in Bolivia publicly before the media and before leaving Moscow. So because of Morales' bold offer, the FBI thought it necessary to intervene, and maybe they did this just to intimidate Morales, or maybe they really thought that this was going to happen. But the FBI thought that Snowden would escape from Moscow with Morales in his presidential jet, because presidential jets have special diplomatic status. And when they fly in the air, they're protected just as much as a state is protected within its borders. The plane is considered a state as far as its protection goes. However, Morales' plane was not given this protection as it should have, and it was forced to land in Europe and be searched for Snowden. I believe it landed in France, but I would have to check up to be 100% sure. I want to say it landed in France, but it was forced to land in Europe, bottom line, where Snowden was unwelcome and rejected asylum in, as I said, 21 European countries. So this really revealed a power structure, the fact that European citizens were standing up and protesting for Snowden, for freedom for Snowden. And Europe was rejecting Snowden. Now, this showed the power structure because it was the U.S. that determined, the U.S. government that determined that he is a traitor and that he has committed acts against the U.S. government under the Espionage Act, and he should be imprisoned probably is what they desired, or at least, go before the courts. And why didn't Snowden just stay in the U.S. and be held accountable? Well, before Snowden, there was Brandon, now known as Chelsea Manning, who was given a sentence of 120 years for leaking classified information. So Snowden was deterred to come clean to the U.S. government because of what had happened with the Manning case. And we'll discuss a little bit about that later. But he was rightfully, he was well incentivized to leave the country upon revealing the Stellar Wind program of the NSA. He was very well incentivized for the sake of keeping his freedom. He didn't want to be in prison for the rest of his life. He didn't want a 120-year life sentence like Chelsea Manning had received, former member of the U.S. Army and former soldier. So Morales' plane, let's get back to the scene here. Morales' plane with special diplomatic status was forced to land in Europe and be searched for Snowden, and this revealed a power structure that Western Europe is under control of the U.S. And in order to combat this and Morales' flight being stopped, WikiLeaks purposely portrayed false routes of the Morales flight to create more trails for surveillance, to separate the intelligence programs, to mitigate the possibility of them stopping Morales, who was innocent and did not have anyone hidden in his plane, any fugitive hidden in his plane. He did publicly offer asylum, but he didn't betray any country and sneak Snowden on his plane. He wasn't willing to go that far, but the fact that the U.S. would make him stop his plane and force him to land in order to search his plane was very excessive, because he rightfully has diplomatic status. And by forcing him to land in Europe, they disrespected Morales. Morales didn't say he was going to take off with Snowden in a plane. That would be one thing with his diplomatic status. He only said that he offered him asylum. So the fact that they made Morales' plane land in Europe to be searched for Snowden was a little bit out there. So when was this temporary asylum officially granted? Well, Federal Migration Services granted Snowden temporary asylum for 1 year. And this was granted while Snowden and Harrison were still in that one room of the airport under the FSB the Russian intelligence agency. And after being in that room with no windows for a month, they were finally granted to leave the airport and have asylum in Moscow. And after this occurred, and they were granted this asylum for 1 year, which he still is in Moscow to this day, 4 years later, excuse me, more like 3 years later, the U.S. government claimed to be disappointed in the Russian government. The U.S. government also claimed Edward Snowden is not a whistleblower. They referred to him as merely a traitor. He betrayed his government by revealing their techniques of collecting data. So Sarah Harrison, who accompanied Edward Snowden on his journey, she's a British journalist, she's a WikiLeaks reporter. She was not one of the initial reporters that met Snowden at the hotel. We've got a picture of Sarah Harrison we showed in the last segment, just to give you all a look of who she is. She took charge of what WikiLeaks called, as I may or may not have said before in this segment, Sarah Harrison was not only a British journalist, she was a WikiLeaks reporter. So by the orders of Julian Assange, she took charge of the Operation Asylum. Operation Asylum was to seek asylum for Edward Snowden, and she accompanied Snowden in his escape out of Hong Kong. Snowden asked Harrison, because of the high risk of the situation, Snowden thought it was very peculiar that a woman was willing to risk her life to help someone, and he even asked Harrison, according to Harrison, why did you do this? Why did you help me? Sarah essentially put her life on the line, and Snowden said, this is a quote of Snowden, Sarah put her life on the line for someone who was a complete stranger to her. Edward Snowden was a complete stranger to her at the time. All she knew was his story. She didn't know him personally. He wasn't a member of her family. There was no personal connection. She thought that what was happening to him was unjust, and she wanted to help him seek asylum because she believed that he was rightfully going about what he was doing. And then we have Michael Hayden. Michael Hayden is the man who is speaking for the CIA and the NSA. He's a former head of the CIA and the NSA. We've got a photo of Hayden. And he ran the Stellar Wind program that Snowden exposed. And again, if you weren't here for the first segment, the Stellar Wind program permitted the search of any individual's communications for the purpose of security against terrorism. Here's a quote from Hayden on Snowden. He said of Snowden that Snowden believed his ethical and legal judgment trumped the judgment of his coworkers, and so on, the American president, and so on, the court system, and everyone else. That was Hayden on Snowden. Hayden thinks of Snowden as actually arrogant, not heroic, for taking it upon himself to report the NSA's breach of individual privacy. Now, this is getting very heated, and it's up to us to determine what we think. Is he a traitor or a hero? And that's still debated among politicians today. It was in the previous presidential debates, at least in the Democratic debate. There's footage of that. And we do know Trump's stance on this issue and Obama's, which I will present to you on the next part of the show. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter at KatieFYNTV and email me with comments and suggestions at katie@fetchyournews.com. Thank you, and I'll see you in just a bit.
What you gonna do with all that junk?
This is the big one, the 20% off MSRP model year-end clearance at Days Chevrolet in Jasper, with huge savings over $3,600 off the redesigned Malibu. Now just $20,400. Save over $8,600 off Silverado Crew Cab LT. Now just $33,500. 20% off new Chevys. Right here, right now, at Days Chevrolet in Jasper.
Better days ahead, Days Chevrolet.
Find new roads.
El Rey and Ellijay.
El Rey Mexican Restaurant.
Family owned and operated and a local favorite for families, parties, and meetings.
Great prices.
Friendly service and delicious Mexican cuisine.
Patio dining available.
Come sing in Carlos's Cantina every Friday 9 to 1.
Eat in or take away.
Same location for 14 years.